Africa. Kalle udutsi hai. Samayado ipatla sabo pilo.
So, welcome to all our listeners. Welcome to Taming Inflation, Extending Plans, and Making Recommitments episode of Ubuntunomics podcast. This month, we look at the SARB increasing interest rates by 75 basis points, National Treasury's update on Operation Vulindlela, and the Agriculture Minister stopping all movement of cattle due to the foot and mouth disease. And in the Africa Regional Update, we look at the plans to return to civilian rule in South Sudan, the 42nd SADC Summit, and the EAC recommitting to the AU Declaration on Land. With me this month is Sbu Nyati from Isakombe Assets. Hello, Sbu. How are you doing this month?
Yes, hi this year. I'm well, thank you, man. Yeah, it's just like always been a very interesting month. Basically, mainly on the political front here in South Africa as we're inching towards December and the ruling party's elective conference. So there's a lot on the political front and also on the economic front. So it's been hectic, trying to catch up with all the developments. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot movement, and as you know, I'm joining you from Kinshasa, the DRC, this month, and I'm also following on the heels of the 42nd SADC Summit. So most definitely, there's a lot going on both domestically and within the region and the rest of the continent this month. Without further ado, let's get started with the essay update in brief. South Africa commemorated Women's Day in August, and the Minister of Finance appointed the National Cabinet representative for the Mangaung Metropolitan Municipality after the failure of instituting Section 139 on the municipality on the 22nd of July. And President Ramaphosa addressed the nation on the national energy crisis on the 25th of July. Minister of Finance published the draft legislation for the two-pot retirement system on the 31st of July. And this month, the Constitutional Court maintained its exclusion of non-resident foreign legal practitioners on the 2nd of August. And the SA Post Office opened, or reviewed rather, its online vehicle license renewal system, which has served over 37,000 clients as at the 2nd of August. And on the 16th of August, Cabinet approved New University of Science and Innovation in Ekurhuleni and the Crime Detection University in Hammanskraal. And on the same day, government commemorated the 10th anniversary of Marikana. And on the 17th of August, the Minister of Transport denied rumors of a fuel levy increase in order for government to pay e-tolls. Meanwhile, on the 18th of August, the Gauteng SAPS Commissioner launched an essential infrastructure task team focusing on the syndicates and theft of essential infrastructure in Gauteng. And President Cyril Ramaphosa attended the SADC Summit in the DRC on the 17th and the 18th of August. And lastly, South Africa is planning a Money Smart Week for 2022 from the 29th of August until the 4th of September. On that note, that takes us to the first story in the essay update. SARB raises repo rate by 0.75%. The Monetary Policy Committee decided to increase the repurchase rate by 75 basis points to 5.5% with effect from 22 July. The repo rate has increased by a total of 200 basis points since 18 November 2021, from 3.5% to where it's at 5.5%. And meanwhile, inflation has risen from 5.5% in November 2021 to 7.3% at the time of the MPC decision against the target of 3 to 6% according to our monetary policy framework. Meanwhile, the SARB expects inflation to reach an average of 6.9% in 2022 and later decrease to 3% in 2023. At the same time, unemployment remains stubbornly high, despite having decreased to 34.5% in the first quarter of 22 from 35.3% in the fourth quarter of 2021. Sbu, what are your thoughts on this story?
Well, from the MPC statement, what I can highlight is what they say. They say global economic conditions remain fragile. Basically, that's where we are at. That the global economic conditions are having a play and are having an impact on South African on how the MPC sees things. It is now apparent that that the South African monetary policy from SARB, their decisions in recent years mirror those of advanced economies, especially the US Central Bank. It has become too predictive that the SARB will raise their repo rate by exactly the same basis points whenever the global economy is facing a downturn. On the other hand, the National Treasury also takes their leaf from Brussels in terms of broad macroeconomic assumptions and our self-imposed ceilings. Since the modern economy is highly financialized and the movement of capital is unencumbered due to excessive deregulation, the SARB hardly ever considers the unemployment rate, despite their claims. Now, this is because their main preoccupation is striving to maintain a positive interest rate differential. The IMF, which they talk about, has not only signaled a lower growth forecast in their World Economic Outlook update, but have now confirmed that there will be a slowdown in world economic growth from 6.2% to 3.2% in 2022, which is quite big.
Wow.
This is basically this is the most
almost.
it is the most dramatic slowdown in recovery. It has not been seen in the past 8 years, and that impact will be felt here in South Africa, because the IMF's growth projections for South Africa are 2.3% for 2022, followed by a corresponding 1.4% growth in 2023, meaning our growth projections will almost halve for 2023. Now we have to juxtapose this with the South African Reserve Bank's projections. Their inflation rate projection for 2023 is 3.23%. So if you take 3% and you look 3% for inflation and 1.4% for growth, which means you are under. So it is clear to say that the country will be scuba diving without an oxygen tank. On the other hand, the U.S. Fed is expected to once again raise interest rates in their upcoming meeting. Now, this strategy has not directly resulted in the alleviation of supply constraints, but it has induced a recessionary environment globally. The SARB will again follow suit, as I've explained earlier, and the 2.3% growth for 2022 will be even harder to attain, because the country will move into the spending holiday season with a paralyzed consumption levels. What will happen is that we shall see higher unemployment, less investment into the economy, lower gross capital formation, a more depressed property sector, and much more profiteering by the banking industry, as attested to by their recent trading results. Banks have made quite a lot of money due to these interest rate hikes. Yeah.
Sure. And my biggest concern is this, right? It seems as though monetary policy and central bankers globally are still going about their business as usual when we're in quite a unique circumstance currently. And I don't know whether they're just buying into the rhetoric being peddled by politicians that the current inflationary environment we're in is as a result purely just on the Russia Ukraine conflict, when in fact it's actually a number of issues which are definitely driving us towards the highly speculated global recession. But
Yeah.
I definitely don't think that any of the actions being taken are going to resolve the issue. I don't think that the current inflationary period is going to be resolved by purely monetary policy interventions as what we've seen. But my question to you, Sbu, is what do you think we need to be doing?
Yeah. Mansi, I think the country should consider stabilization measures, um, because the South African, as you were saying, the inflation targeting model is just not working. It's not cracked out to what it was supposed to be. The US, for example, they, I know, sometimes I get frustrated because we copy what the US does, but the US also targets employment. It is most concerned about employment. But in South Africa, we don't do that. We just only look at price stabilization. Anyway, the US, for example, has introduced the Inflation Reduction Act. And within that is the Emergency Price Stabilization Act. I mean, what I think we should do is we should stop being straitjacketed and look into setting up a temporary body that will watch and apply limits to price increases, in things like transportation costs and things like food costs, in fuels and electricity. I mean, NERSA is the regulator, but we should have a stick. We should be watching even NERSA. I mean, we should try to lower these costs as much as we can.
Definitely. Yeah, NERSA really has become a thorn, I think, in the side of the country in a way. If you look at, for example, the many contestations that people have just had on their pricing models as well as the pricing methodology. There was a time at which, for example, on the electricity front, they were reviewing the pricing methodology and at the same time issuing new pricing tariffs, like which you have to choose one of the two and not both at the same time. At the same time, the same NERSA has been creating so much confusion in the gas sector, for example, so much so that, despite companies such as Sasol having a clear monopoly in South Africa, have decided not to opt into implementing the pricing coming from NERSA because it's outrageous. It's almost a doubling of the actual current pricing, mainly because they've changed the methodology on the gas pricing side of things. So I think we definitely need to do a review of NERSA, its mandate, as well as even all of its methodologies and how it's actually structured to drive the country and the globe out of the current inflationary period we're in. We definitely are going to need this cooperation between fiscal and monetary policy measures, and I don't think that purely aiming or targeting monetary policy interventions at the problem of inflation is going to be the solution. And I think, yes, price stabilization interventions are definitely one of the key issues. And I think, which is the other coin of the South African monetary policy framework, right? Because the dual mandate, both on the value of the rand as well as containing inflation, doesn't just necessitate the Reserve Bank focusing on interest rates as well as our balance of payments from the point of view of a current account deficit. They could be playing a much more active role in ensuring that we are more, the exchange rate favors our exports in order to ensure that we have a current account surplus, which would also maintain, the strength and value of the rand without focusing purely on trying to attract capital inflows, which are volatile and have this impact of creating vulnerabilities in the economy that you cannot necessarily deal with from a sovereign national sort of domestic policy point of view. And there needs to be much more concerted cooperation between monetary policy and fiscal policy authorities, especially given that the current inflationary environment is not as a result of things which can be resolved purely on interest rate, because it's not demand-driven inflationary period that we're in. It's actually on the supply side where there are constraints creating this issue, on top of the global problems, obviously, of the stimulus that the US pumped in, which is also then creating all this uncertainty in the global economy. So I definitely agree with you in terms of the kind of innovative approach that we need to take in order to stabilize inflation in the country. On that note, that takes us to the second story in the SA update, a Q2 update on Operation Vulindlela. Operation Vulindlela is a joint initiative of the Presidency and National Treasury to accelerate the implementation of structural reforms and support economic recovery. Currently, the priority interventions for Operation Vulindlela include fixing Eskom and improving electricity supply, enabling private investment in electricity generation, accelerating new electricity supply from renewables, gas, and battery storage, and encouraging private investment in rooftop solar, as well as transforming the electricity sector to achieve long-term sustainability. At this point in the second quarter of 2022, 9 out of 26 structural reforms have been completed and 11 are currently in progress. Smoo?
Yeah, the government's energy plan has received much criticism, and unfortunately, much of Operation Vulindlela has to do with the 15-year-long energy crisis in the country, which has gotten much worse in the last half decade, despite their interventions. Concerning power shortages, which lead to the to load shedding, blackouts, I have maintained that the main problem has to do with unplanned breakdowns. The country has about 17 gigawatts of capacity that can't be employed due to weak management and failure to deal with causes of these breakdowns. Old coal power plants can be refurbished and they can be re-engineered to increase their lifespan. This is done everywhere in the world. Plus, our power plants are on average not as old as those in the US or in Europe. Secondly, we have built a considerable fleet of renewable generation units owned and operated by the private sector. The problem is that the technologies used do not provide dispatchable energy that can come in to rescue the system when demand is high. The government has provided 200 billion rands worth of guarantees to these private owned renewable energy operators. What we're doing is effectively de-risking private investment without meaningful returns for those. Operation Vulindlela advocates for more of the same. That is where the disconnect is, in my opinion, because you have these the renewable technologies that we're using are not dispatchable and they're costly.
Yeah, look, I agree with you there wholeheartedly. And I think one of the big criticisms I have for Operation Vulindlela is that it's actually not linked to any concerted plan, right? Like, it's a recovery plan, but we're actually just putting a plaster on the issue, right? We're focusing on the symptoms and not necessarily changing. For example, you mentioned in terms of the new generation from renewables that we keep adding to, the national grid. But as you say, none of that is actually dispatchable and none of that is actually connected to the main grid itself. And in fact, what we're seeing with the current window and what is still to come with Windows 6, etc., is that majority of these additional private renewable generation is actually focused on specific private plants, right? Ever since government has opened up in terms of private generation for firms are actually trying to delink themselves from Eskom. For me, that spells a huge problem, not only for Eskom, but for the country as a whole, because essentially now we're putting ourselves on a trajectory where those who have the power in order, or the money in order to make up for government lack in terms of infrastructure, etc., are going to invest private money, and those who still rely on public resources or public infrastructure or public investment will have to just wait until government is able to make the commitments or make the investments where necessary. And without government actually making those moves currently, opening up the space for so-called private sector participation, is not actually putting us on the right path towards sustainability. What is to happen of the majority of the population who still rely on ESCOM, when ESCOM is not going to be making any income from its industrial clients because they will be off grid effectively? And we already know the problem of the majority who do rely on ESCOM or public energy generation is that a large proportion of these people are indigent people who cannot actually afford to pay, the market rate for the public services which they receive. And yeah, for me, it's just you're pushing the can down the road, and we're setting ourselves up for quite a national disaster in terms of the energy crisis. Just mainly because what Operation Vulindlela does is highlight some of the symptoms and the problems we're seeing, and provides a solution that's not linked to any broader plan or any government government narrative. I'm not seeing it. Operation Vulindlela is more about band-aid solutions to some of the structural problems that we face, and I'm not seeing structural changes or even long-term resolution to some of these structural problems that we're facing.
Yeah, we're looking at efficiencies mainly, uh, whereas I think, and we are all agreed that the country needs massive investments in the real economy. We keep on talking about our gross capital expenditure. Yeah, I mean capital formation as a percentage of GDP at something like 13%, whereas it should be up at 30%. So we need lots. We need investments. I mean, even one of these bodies, I think it's BUSA or it is. But one of these business bodies said we need something like 3 trillion rands investment in the next in the medium term, 3 years. You know, so, but anyway, I am not averse to private sector involvement, just as long as there is value for all stakeholders concerned and no excessive profiteering. So we can get all that money from the private sector. I'm fine with that. Now, it has been revealed by the head of Infrastructure South Africa, Dr. Kgosientsho Ramakgopa, that the country, I'm talking about municipalities, provincial and national government, that we return, say, 43 billion rands annually back to the national treasury. Money that has been budgeted for but has been unspent. Now, South Africa has another problem. I mean, on top of all these efficiencies and no plan and no vision and a weak vision and all everything that we always moan about. But now we also have a spending problem. We do not have the expertise within government to carry out the planning, the licensing, the designs, the designing, procurement. We do not have enough project management capacity and auditing capacities at a state level. In fact, 220 of our 254 municipalities do not have an engineer employed. So we're relying on the private sector for all of these professional services at exorbitant fees and with little guarantee that we will get value for that buck. So yeah.
Yeah. No, we really, really, really have a problem. And, for most people, they try to craft this problem as though there is a money problem. Clearly, there's not, if we're returning on average annually 43 billion rand back to National Treasury. Secondly, clearly, like there's a lot of money that needs to go there. We just have serious implementation gaps in terms of the technical skills required, but also government is completely failing on its role as disciplining and redirecting capital towards areas that will have a national interest. And it's one of those crucial things that developmental states are supposed to do, which is coordinate or discipline and control private capital or private interest into generating returns or towards the national interest. And that's where we're completely failing. We seem to think that the problem is money. It's not money. We seem to think that the problem is there's just no ideas. There's just the problem is clearly people with no ideas, no control or coordination capacity in terms of being able to coordinate private interest for the sake of national interest. And it's very concerning because we're focusing on the wrong things and focusing on the symptoms rather than trying to understand clearly what the problems are and resolving those in our interventions. Instead, you're right, we're focusing on this little bit of inefficiencies here and there, and we're not even making a dent on the so-called structural issues, despite the focus on these 26 structural reforms that are taking place under Operation Vulindlela.
Yeah.
On that note, that takes us to the last story in the SA update. The Agriculture Minister stops all movement of cattle. The Minister of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development, Ms. Toko Didiza, has suspended all movement of cattle in South Africa due to the continuing spread of foot and mouth disease, FMD. There are currently 116 outbreaks of FMD involving farms, feedlots, and communal areas in Free State, Gauteng, KwaZulu-Natal, Limpopo, Northwest, and Mpumalanga provinces. FMD can infect sheep, goats, pigs, and cloven-hooved game animals, and animals showing symptoms such as salivation, blisters in the mouth, and limping or hoof lesions must not be moved under any circumstances, according to the Minister of Agriculture.
This is a recurring problem, and from the reports I have seen, there has been ineffective measures employed since the last outbreak. I think we reported the last outbreak. The inefficiency has led to a wide spread of the disease, especially into provinces which had been spared the last time. The economic damage is severe, both for the small scale and the commercial farmer. The disease imperils them so much, these farmers, so much that normal farming activities grind to a crawl because suddenly these people can't go to market. Their auctions are forbidden and there is no slaughtering. So you must remember, some of them would slaughter upwards of 2,000 cows per day. I mean, this is massive. So the Eastern Cape, for instance, which exports wool to various global markets, but especially China, which is our main market, is now sitting with thousands of tons of bales. The Chinese officials have halted imports from our country, even though the few weeks quarantine period that is required has already lapsed. They still say, no, nothing from South Africa. So without markets, without markets, and you're an agricultural producer, you can forget. I mean, agriculture is all about markets.
And already we're having problems with some of our traditional markets, such as the EU, when it comes to citrus, etc. And we're adding more additional lines on those agricultural exports that aren't going to find themselves markets with this foot and mouth disease. We really need to have a concerted effort in dealing with these. And it speaks to our unpreparedness to deal with these sort of disasters. For me, this forms part of what we should be ensuring we are resilient towards and being able to quickly and effectively respond within record time. Because, as you say, the longer you spend without having access to these markets, the more you're destroying your own agricultural sector as a country.
Yeah, and farmers should also play ball, because some of these farmers sneak their animals into areas that were disease free, and some of them would be transporting at night and things like that. I mean, they should also know that they are shooting themselves in the foot. Excuse the pun.
Yeah, nice one. On that note, that brings an end to the essay update for this month. That brings us to the reminder to all our listeners, regardless of whatever platform you're listening through, please hit the like button and share amongst your family and friends. On that note, that brings us to the Africa regional update in brief. There seems to be quite a lot happening in West Africa, with ECOWAS condemning terrorist attacks in Bamako, Mali on the 22nd of July and deploying observers to the Senegalese elections on the 31st of July, as well as condemning the rising political tensions in Guinea on the 31st of July and condemning violence in Sierra Leone on the 10th of August. And lastly, the second East African Community Regional Tourism Expo is scheduled for the 23rd until the 30th of September. On that note, that brings us to the Africa Regional Update's first story, the return to civilian rule in South Sudan by 2025. The reconstituted Transitional Government of National Unity in South Sudan signed an agreement on the roadmap to a peaceful and democratic end to the transitional period. The transitional period was extended by 2 years until the 22nd of February 2025 to complete the outstanding tasks in the peace agreement. And the chairperson of the African Union Commission, His Excellency Musa Faki Mahamat, has urged the transitional authorities to fulfill their pledge to fully implement the 2018 revitalized agreement on the resolution of the conflict in South Sudan. Sbu?
Yeah, the AU, neighboring countries which have an interest in lasting peace, and IGAD have to be commended for their efforts. So are the two main contenders, Salva Kiir and Riek Machar, and their followers from both the Dinka and the newer ethnic groups. There seems to be a commitment to return to proper civilian rule and the attainment of the 2011 independence promise. This has been a prolonged period of peace, this current one, and there's been calm. The guns have been somewhat silenced. The ceasefire and power sharing revitalized agreement on the resolution of the conflict in South Sudan, which was signed by Mashar's opposition party alongside other rebel factions and the current government way back in August 2018, was a good foundation for all of this, what we're saying. The country needs to solidify their efforts, though, by ensuring that programs to deal with their perennial food insecurity are implemented. South Sudan still has to wrestle with their humanitarian crisis, with 67% of their 9 million population estimated to be in need of assistance. To add on to that, there is the problem of a population that has been that is displaced. Nearly 1.6 million are displaced internally, and some 2.3 million are refugees in 6 different countries. So peace and a return to civilian rule are a welcome development, but they just need to tighten up on food insecurity and sort out the population displacement crisis. Yeah, but it's a nice one. It's nice to have some good news from that country.
Definitely, especially since they've been struggling for over 10 years. If you remember the last story we actually covered on South Sudan, on agreeing on a government, really, on a constitution as well. So I think this is a positive development. I do worry, though, that a lot of distractions and uncertainties, given the drought and the current socioeconomic challenges you're highlighting, may derail them, especially since they've already had to extend the current transitional period by a further 2 years. I'm very, very concerned, but I think this is it's a small win in the right direction, and I hope that the country is able to continue down this path as they move towards implementing their transition.
Yep. Yeah.
On that note, that takes us to the next story in the Africa Regional Update, the 42nd SADC Summit. The 42nd Summit of the Heads of State and Government of the Southern African Development Community SADC was held on the 17 and 18 August in Kinshasa, DRC. Summit noted progress on the conflicts and violent protests in the DRC, Eswatini, Lesotho, and Mozambique. And Summit received progress reports on the SADC mission in Lesotho, Mozambique, and the DRC and Eswatini. Summit urged Lesotho to expedite the reforms program, approved the extension of the mission in Mozambique, and plans to meet with the United Nations to explore additional support for the DRC security challenges, and is currently planning a summit to find a peaceful and lasting solution to the security challenges in Eswatini. Boo, what are your thoughts?
Well, the region should mature, I think. The navel gazing has to come to an end for the region to prosper and maintain a semblance of political and security stability. Having said that, we must acknowledge and come up with solutions concerning the historic formation of some of these unstable countries, that is Lesotho, and Eswatini, and to a lesser extent Mozambique. We are in the 21st century, and so an absolute monarchy in the case of Eswatini, or the parliamentary constitutional monarchy form of government in the case of Lesotho, will always lead to uncertainty and possibilities of civil unrest. Both forms of government are proving to be no longer popular within those countries. This challenge, though, needs a regional approach, or else we will continue having these regional security threats. I think this is a systemic challenge, and the region keeps applying bandages while the wound festers. I mean, we talk about transitional justice, national healing, inconsequential reform in the case of Lesotho and Eswatini. We need proper drastic reforms. Otherwise, these will not yield any results. Because back in 2014, political and military interventions had to be employed in Lesotho. SADC was almost called into action again last year in Eswatini. We covered that unrest. Basically, our borders in the region and the colonial mindset which brought about the formation of these polities is untenable. Mozambique, Lesotho, and Eswatini have always been these labor reserves. When there was a mining boom in the Republic of South Africa, these countries remain underdeveloped as a consequence of that. And this gives rise to opportunistic security threats, as was the case in Cabo Delgado. So the SADC regional bloc has to move forward with their main vision and goals. They talk about regional integration and sustainable development. This will pave the way towards better harmonization of policies and positive socio-economic outcomes. South Africa, when we've seen with the Zamazamas, which are the criminal mining syndicates, South Africa cannot prosper on its own. It needs a prosperous region, because the region is intertwined historically with South Africa. Yeah, that's my position about SADC.
Yeah, most definitely. It's just such a pity that we're also too preoccupied with our own domestic challenges as a country. But you're right, we do need to stabilize the SADC region. And it's just quite sad, really, that we keep losing more and more countries in the SADC region. I mean, the challenge and the economic crisis that still Zimbabwe is struggling to recover from. Then there's the issues in Lesotho and Eswatini, which we're discussing now, and Mozambican issue. And I worry that, once we lose all of the countries around South Africa, the last piece to fall will be us. And we really need to take a different and more proactive role in stabilizing the region.
Yeah, yes.
On that note, that brings us to the last story in the Africa Regional Update. The East African Community recommits to implementing the AU Declaration on Land. The East African Community EAC's regional platform for sharing lessons and best practices in land policy development was held on the 17 and 18 August in Kampala, Uganda. The platform was organized by the EAC Secretariat and the African Land Policy Center, the ALPC, to facilitate sharing of experiences, information, lessons learned, and best practices in land reform policy formulation and implementation. The African Union Declaration on Land urges member states to develop comprehensive land policies and address specific needs of each country and build an adequate human, financial, and technical capacities in accordance with the framework and guidelines on land policy in Africa.
This topic is so contentious, and it can lead to polarization and disintegration of countries or even these regional blocs. The EAC itself has different regimes within that regional bloc. Take, for instance, the DRC and Tanzania, which have massive, which are big, massive land, big land masses. Tanzania is totally different to other countries around in terms of land ownership and its tenure systems. Then there is all that mineral wealth in the Eastern DRC, claims and counterclaims to ownership due to internal wars of conquest. Tanzania, you list that land. In the DRC, there's no proper land tenure policy. There's instability. You then have the condensed and highly populated central republics of Rwanda and Burundi. And you also have the historic Mwami system, that feudal Tutsi ownership, land ownership, and wealth ownership system. That mixed with that is the inequality problems that come with that system, as highlighted by the many revolts by the Hutu majority, who happen to be underclasses and landless. And then you have the Baganda kingship in Uganda, and that kingdom owns vast tracts of land, and they use it to make political claims on the on that state. Then you have all the many kingdoms and the connections to land and proximity to power in Uganda. And just recently, there were the forced removals of the Maasai from tribal lands in Kenya, and this led to confrontation and now some deaths. So basically, my view is that Africa needs to resolve its challenge of African feudalism and the wealth inequality that ensues from that kind of system. Europe had the European feudalism, and then they dealt with it. Then they had republics. So in the last story, we dealt with Mozambique, with Eswatini and Lesotho. Those are still monarchies. So as Chairman Mao, the Chinese Mao Zedong is known to have famously said, he said, "Do not forget the class struggle." So in Africa, we ignore the class struggle and we refuse to engage it as part of our revolution. This is a political problem, basically, in my view. And you can't sort it out by coming up with these ill-conceived policies I mean, you will always muddy waters. I mean, basically, on the one hand, we want to recognize our and appreciate our cultures, but at the same time, we have to deal with the elephant in the room, and that is African feudalism. Yeah.
Yeah, most definitely. And, I want to extend it a bit further. And Africa's feudalism linked to slave trade and the colonial history, which is so divisive in itself. And I think it is all of these remnants of our past that are also still informing the divisions, especially when it comes to tribalism and other forms of politicking on the continent, which we really just need to let go and move on from. It's just such a pity that those are still the source of power for most of our ruling elite on the continent.
Yeah, see, and I don't know whether we really, the definition of a republic is understood, and I don't know. I don't know whether we understand that, or even democracy. I think though we had we had a discussion the other day about democracy, whether the African interpretation of democracy is the same as in the Western world or in China, or should it be the same? I don't know.
Mm. And we have an inherent aversion towards democracy in the true sense, mainly because African culture is largely paternalistic in its viewpoint and its approach, which we can park that aside. But there are many benefits of democracy which we aren't realizing, mainly because of this paternalistic culture we still maintain. Yeah. So yeah, these are the serious questions which are still in many ways holding us back, and in many ways are what is needed in order to, the reforms that are needed to take us forward as a continent and as people generally. I was having a discussion this afternoon around particularly this issue of democracy and the accountability that not representative democracy but direct democracy allows for people. So if people can choose, not only the people who are in the city council or the mayors, etc., but all the way as the power cascades. And one of the central things that disconnects people from accountability to their constituency is this representative democracy, which removes leadership from accountability, or people who are voting for them directly in the systems that we have of our political systems. And that really doesn't allow for the kind of leadership and moral regeneration that we need in our politics in order to take ourselves forward as a continent and as a people.
Yeah, in South Africa, we have the Ingonyama Trust. They're the biggest landowners in KwaZulu Natal, and that is linked to that traditional leadership in that province. And it's a problem that we also have to face. I mean, our land reform processes have not. Our land reform has been lacking.
Yeah, yeah, most definitely, most definitely. On that note, that brings an end to the Africa Regional Update for this month. And that takes us to the numbers game.
Oh yeah, you've got big numbers this time. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so our number this month is negative 8% year on year in June 2022. What do you think this number is related to, Sue?
Oh, negative 8%. Year on year. My God, I just I'm just going to take a step in the dark. It has to do with manufacturing. I don't know. I'm not. No, this time around, no.
Very close, very, very, very close, but
Yes.
unfortunately, no cigar. So the actual number is regarding or related to mining production. So it's mining production that decreased by 8% year on year in June 2022. And
Mhm.
seasonally adjusted mining production decreased by 1.4% on a month-to-month basis in June 2022, compared to a 1.2% increase in May. Meanwhile, on a quarter-on-quarter basis, mining production decreased by 3.4% compared to the running 3-month average of a 0.6% increase during May. So it seems as though the second quarter for 2022 was not very good for our mining production.
And it might be linked to load shedding that we talked about.
Precisely. And it's so sad that at a time when commodity prices are in a boom or have recovered, we're not taking advantage of that given our production numbers contracting significantly. And
Yeah,
at a time when the country really needs to be growing, our mining sector seems to be lagging behind.
I was reading an article this just today about our coal mining companies making a killing because of all the coal that they're having to export to the EU. But
Mm,
on how she's on the flip side, and when I see this -8%, it's like, what has happened?
yeah, yeah. Very concerning nonetheless. I think we are going through a bit of a rocky path and a rocky patch, both as a country and a region, the continent as a whole. And we'll have to see how the European winter holds up for us to see whether we're going to end 2022 on a good or a bad note, given all these global uncertainties and shifts in the geopolitical context as a whole.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
On that note, that brings an end to our episode this month.
Africa, I